Welcome to another OSSET History Revision podcast with your head of history, Mr. Otway. In this podcast we will consider why for such a long time the American West was a lawless place. Some examples of the types of crimes committed, examples of a famous criminal and a famous lawman, how the Wild West became a bit less lawless, and finally we will look at the Johnson County War. Why was the West at first such a lawless place? There are several reasons, and we will consider three of the main contributing factors. Firstly, the towns in the West sprang up quickly, particularly with the gold rush from 1848 onwards. It was difficult, if not impossible, to make sure that every new town had law enforcement officers. A town sprung up wherever gold was found, and they were abandoned just as quickly if the gold deposits were exhausted. Secondly, the spaces between the towns, the spaces separating the towns, could be vast, and it was very difficult to travel between them, especially before the railroads, and even with the railroads only went to certain cities, certain big towns. Without fast travel, it was difficult for the few sheriffs and law enforcers to maintain law and order, as they often arrived long after crimes had been committed and the criminals had made their getaway. Thirdly, there were a number of people with different occupations and interests, all trying to share the same land. It was pretty much inevitable that ranchers would squabble over who had the right to herd their cows in certain areas or to use certain waterholes. The same can be applied to the inevitability of homesteaders arguing with each other, or with ranchers for that matter, and then you can throw into the mix the Plains Indians, who thought that nobody had the right to own land. And we should mention the gold prospectors, who were desperate to strike it rich and didn't care at all who they were upsetting, especially if there were other prospectors, and sometimes they tried to claim jump, steal the gold resources that had already been found. Surely now you can see why there was so much potential for conflict, and therefore a problem with a lack of law enforcers in the West, and therefore a wild and lawless land. And so we move on to the types of crimes committed, and there were many, most of which though would be crimes that were also committed all around the world at the time. The problem with the American West was the frequency that such crimes were carried out and the amount of opportunity for them to happen in the absence of a proper law enforcement system. There were bank robberies, cattle rustling, fence cutting and rearranging the fences to make your land a bit bigger than your neighbours, horse stealing, they were very valuable, like a modern day car is to us in many cases, murder. Historians estimate around 600 a year, which is not surprising in a place with so much conflict, where practically every man carried a gun. There were racial attacks, especially when Chinese workers were brought in to help construct the railroads. For example, there was an incident in Rock Springs, Iowa in 1885 when 51 Chinese workers were killed and 400 thrown out of town by people afraid that the Chinese were taking all their jobs. Yes, that old argument which comes up again every so often. There was also trail robbery, which was robbing stagecoaches, which led to people paying for protection. The person paid to do that, usually rode up at the front of the wagon, and usually carried a shotgun. Hence the saying, riding shotgun, and why so many people shout, shotgun, when they want to sit in the front seat of the car. And last but not least, train robbery, which led to the railroad companies employing armed guards. Well, we'll look at two famous people now from the Wild West. A criminal first. Billy the Kid, probably the most famous criminal to have ever lived in the West. Started his life of crime aged just 16 and was shot dead by a man named Sheriff Garrett in 1881, aged just 21. During his short but eventful life, he killed 8 men, well, we're pretty certain about that, but he may well have killed more. He escaped from jail at least 3 times, and he specialised in cattle rustling. On the other side of the coin, you've got a man whose surname I'm struggling to pronounce, and I can't find anywhere on the internet which tells me. So I'm going to go, well, it's written down for you on the podcast. I'm going to go for William Tilghman. It may well be Tillman, but I'm going for Tilghman. Was a famous, respected law enforcer. He was a crack shot and claimed to have killed over 12,000 buffalo, helping to end the Plains Indian way of life along with thousands of other Americans who came west. And he upsetted some Cheyenne Indians in the process, who duly tried to attack him. He killed 7 Cheyenne Indian braves, and then moved to Dodge City, eventually becoming Marshal of the city, which was the highest law enforcement position to hold in that city. He got a reputation for his intelligence, using clever disguises and setting criminals up so he could catch them, only ever resorting to force if necessary. He later moved on to Oklahoma and was recognized as being the person most responsible for wiping out organized crime in Oklahoma. He rounded up 3 notorious gangs there, the Doolins, the Daltons and the Star Gang. It was claimed he was paid more money, more reward money, like the type you see on the wanted posters from the classic American West films. It was claimed he was paid more of this reward money than any other person in the West. He lived a long life before being shot dead, aged 70, still doing what he loved, trying to catch criminals. Just like Billy the Kid, you can see Tilghman portrayed in a number of films on the American West. The Wild West didn't stay lawless forever, and things did begin to improve up to 1900. Before things improved, any law enforcement tended to be done by vigilantes, who could be useful in running criminals out of town, or even killing them, but it was basically a mob of people taking the law into their own hands. Things sometimes got out of hand. Although in Bannack, Montana, Sheriff Henry Plummer, there was a bit of an incident there with him that the vigilantes helped to sort out, because Plummer was the sheriff, and he was failing to catch and sort out a gang who were robbing people on the roads and trails around the town, until it was found out that Henry, naughty old Henry, was secretly the leader of the gang, so of course he's not going to catch them. A vigilante mob caught Plummer and hanged him in 1864. But as I mentioned, things sometimes got out of hand, and people often ended up fearing the vigilantes as much as the criminals, because the vigilante groups sometimes might use it as an opportunity to get rid of somebody they didn't like through making false accusations. I mean, there's an extreme example, but you can see why people might be a bit scared of mobs going around trying to dish out the law and justice without really putting people on trial. In the early days, there was also the option of people using the wonderfully named Pinkerton Detective Agency, who were a private detective company that people paid to bring people to justice in the absence of proper law enforcers, as well as occasionally to provide protection. But providing protection, it just doesn't sound like a fearsome name to me. If I was a criminal and I heard that the Pinkerton Detective Agency were coming after me, I wouldn't be fearsome. But anyway, they did a pretty decent job by all accounts, and they were an option to people who had enough money to pay for them. Anyway, as more states were established and the railroads brought federal law to the West, there was more of a structure to law enforcement. For example, large towns would elect town marshals, and alongside them at the bottom of the structure, often looking after a number of small towns in a county, were the sheriffs. Above the town marshals and sheriffs were the deputy marshals, and then the US marshals at the top of the pile looking after the whole state. There was still an issue though, as there weren't enough law enforcers to go around, and when a criminal was caught, he had to stay in jail until a federal judge could travel to judge at the trial. Federal, by the way, this word I keep saying, refers to government, federal government of America. It's the country. If the government can send a judge, that's what they had to do to start the trial. This left criminals, anyway, in jail often for long periods, as the judges had to travel to massive distances between these jails to sort out the trials. And these prisoners left in jail for long periods, well, sometimes their gangs would try and break them out, and jailbreaks. On the other hand, it also meant that lynch mobs sometimes broke into the jail. Not wanting to wait for the judges for justice, people took the law into their own hands and killed a particular prisoner. It would be wrong to say that these things were likely to happen, but both jailbreaks and lynch mobs did happen in the Wild West. Finally, we must look at the case of the Johnson County War, which was less of a war and more of a big argument that got out of hand between ranchers and homesteaders. As we have discussed, homesteaders and ranchers were quite likely to come into conflict due to arguments about things such as land ownership and water sources. The cattle ranchers had got to Johnson County first, becoming very rich in the booming cattle industry, which you can hear about in another podcast, and had set up their own little organisation called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. The problems came in the 1880s, which included some disastrous years for the cattle ranchers. Again, see podcast on cattle industry. And this increased the feelings of bitterness and resentment between cattle ranchers and the growing number of Homesteaders in Johnson County. And they were often arguing about land ownership and water resources, as I've mentioned. However, it was the issue of cattle rustling that sparked everything off. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association accused the homesteaders of rustling the cattle of their members. One ranch owner named Albert Bothwell took matters into his own hands, gathered a mob of supporters, and lynched Ella Watson and Jim Averill, who were shop owners accused of cattle rustling. My Yorkshireness came out a bit too much there. Silly Jim Averill had previously angered the ranchers by writing in a local newspaper that they were nothing but rich land grabbers, and Albert Bothwell had had enough. But it's also likely that the ranchers genuinely believed that Ella and Jim were cattle rustlers because Ella sometimes worked as a prostitute, sometimes accepting cows as payment for her services. Attacks on homesteaders followed this lynching, and the Wyoming Stock Growers Association hired 22 Texan gunmen to come and shoot down what they called the troublemakers, handing these Texan gunmen a hit list of 70 names and offering a $50 bonus for every one of the homesteaders on the list to be killed. The homesteaders did not take this lying down. They formed their own group called the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association and prepared to protect themselves from the gunslingers that were on their way. The ranchers in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association planned a full-scale invasion of Johnson County with, by the way, the full knowledge of the mayor of Johnson County, who seemed to be on the ranchers' side. The attack began with an assault on the KC Ranch and just two men called Nate Champion and Nick Ray, who managed to hold up the whole invasion force. Nick Ray was shot and killed, but Nate continued the fight for the whole day until the cabin was set on fire and he was burned out and shot. The ranchers nailed the notice, which read, "Cattle thieves beware," to Nate's bullet-riddled body. But the heroic resistance of Champion and Ray meant that word reached the sheriff of Johnson County before the invasion could really get going, and the sheriff raised a force of 300 men to go and deal with these ranchers carrying out the attacks. The sheriff and his men attacked and besieged the ranchers before the US 6th Cavalry Regiment arrived to restore peace and stop the fight. This is a stark and dramatic example of conflict between homesteaders and cattlemen that the law at the time was just quite unable to stop from happening. And it is again another example how people took the law into their own hands. The lawlessness of the Wild West is what made it so attractive to Hollywood film producers over the years, and given the handful of stories shared here, you can see why they might think they could make some big box office hits. Things improved through time with the appointment of sheriffs, town marshals, deputy marshals, and the full US Marshals, who were appointed by the president himself to oversee law in a certain state. But things hadn't improved enough to stop the ranchers trying to take the law into their own hands as late as 1892 with the Johnson County War. I've been Mr. Otway, and this was an OSIT History Revision podcast.